life's best could be just a thought away, just a thought away. Where life's best could be just a thought away, just a thought away. Where life's best could be just a thought away, just a thought away. Where life's best could be just a thought away.
I want to talk to you tonight about the whole issue of communication, of what it is that it takes to build a life, and then what it takes to build through that life into other lives. I'd like to read for you a passage of scripture that's rather blunt, and I have entitled my message, Raised to Run. Raised to Run. And it comes to me from Genesis chapter 25, and I'm reading from verse 19. This is the account of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, please notice now, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And it goes on to say, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. You know, I understand full well that there's always a paucity, a shortage of words in which to sometimes describe rather long scenarios. And maybe there's a lot that could have been said there, but wasn't said at that juncture. It's just said that these 2 boys were born. One was going to serve the other in reverse fashion. Normally, the younger would serve the older, but in this instance, the older was going to serve the younger. 2 nations were in the process of being formed, and as they were brought into the world, one became a hunter that appealed to the dad, and one was a quiet man living about the tents that appealed to his mother. Strange, isn't it, how so much can be said in such few words. And as I begin into my message tonight and talk about the next saga, the next segment of a ministry like ours, I want to learn from the scriptures and see what it is that we ought to learn when we see a young life coming into this world and what God intends for us to do as those who guide the younger generation. Raised to run. That's who Jacob was. He ran for the most of his life, running from things he had done and afraid of the repercussions and the consequences. Ever seen somebody like that? When I look at a young life like Jacob, it became that sort of life, a kind of a payday someday. Many years ago, somebody wrote this, and I've still not been able to track down who the author is. But it said this: in the 1950s, kids lost their innocence. They were liberated from their parents by well-paying jobs, cars, and lyrics and music that gave rise to a new term, the generation gap. In the 1960s, kids lost their authority. It was the decade of protest, church, state, and parents were all called into question and found wanting. Their authority was rejected, yet nothing ever replaced it. In the 1970s, kids lost their love. It was the decade of meism, dominated by hyphenated words, beginning with self, self-image, self-esteem, self-assertion. It made for a very lonely world. Kids learned everything there was to know about sex, forgot everything there was to know about love, and very few had the nerve to tell them that there was indeed a difference. In the 1980s, kids lost their hope, stripped of innocence, authority, and love, and plagued by the horror of a nuclear nightmare. Large and growing numbers of this generation stopped believing in the future. And if I were to look at the 1990s, I would say this. In the 1990s, kids have lost themselves, trapped in a virtual world of their own, away from voices and from touch. They have all fallen into cyberspace, not knowing whether they are talking to a person or a machine. They've lost themselves. Having lost innocence, authority, love, hope, finally, the very self is lost. And now we are asked to minister to this kind of a generation. You see, what we often forget is that every life comes into this world almost, not quite, as a blank slate. Not quite as a blank slate. There are ideas already shaped. There is the imago Dei, the image of God, which gives them their moral reasoning and self-determination. But something has to be brought to bear upon those minds to guide and to nurture them. I have found it alarmingly real that most young people I talk to, if I were to pause for just a moment and ask them, how do you make your decisions in life? They are first puzzled by the question, then in greater consternation about the answer. They almost want to know, why are you even asking such a question? And yet when we go to the university campuses, they are packed to capacity. One of the most recent ones I did was in November last year at Yale. Yale is one of the most sophisticated institutions in the world, one of the finest institutions in the world. And this was a Thursday night in an open forum where I was to address the question, is Jesus the only way to God? That auditorium was so full that the doors were jammed, you couldn't even get in. Van loads of students were covering 100, 150 miles to get there. And one of the members of the Board of Trustees looked at one of my colleagues and said to him, I don't believe what I'm seeing. He said, if you brought any great world leader here on a weeknight, and he named 2 or 3 of them, he said, I don't think this auditorium would be full, because anybody who's anybody comes to Yale and our students get tired of hearing them. What on earth are they doing on a Thursday night to listen to a talk about God? You see, the question ought to have made an obvious answer. It is because you can go through a complete education and graduate with a total barrenness in your soul. One of my friends who's a professor at the 3rd largest university in China was visiting my office. He's been in China for many years. And he was telling us, when he was sitting at the table in my office in Atlanta, he said this. He said, one professor of communism said to me recently, stop criticizing communism. It has done you the greatest favor by leaving the souls of our people barren. That's why you have an opportunity to tell them about God. See, education and ideology can leave your soul barren. And young people can go through life wondering what life is really all about. A child, when that child comes into the world, is one of the most electrifying realities in life. G.K. Chesterton said he learned more from observing a nursery than he ever did from studying philosophy. You watch a little one, they'll bring in wonder, they will raise questions. Today, one of our colleagues around the table was telling us that This little girl looked into her mother's eyes and said, "Mommy, why do you have a few white hairs when the rest are black?" Teaching moment. And so the mother said, "You know, sweetheart, every time you do something bad or sad that disappoints me and breaks my heart and saddens me, one of my hairs turns white." The daughter paused and said, "Mommy, why is grandma's hair completely white?" I'll let you figure out why mine is. A child. I used to tell this story in years gone by. The kids are now older and they get embarrassed when I tell them. Sarah's in her 30s now. But when she was only 3, we were crossing over from Jordan into Israel. And we stopped there at just crossed over the Allenby Bridge at the West Bank, and the lineup was long. You had to wait for hours before they would stamp your passport. And I was holding Sarah in my arms. It was a long day. It was going to be a long day. But there's an Israeli soldier standing there, a young man, and he kept looking at her. Her brown eyes, her olive complexion. And he came over to her and looked at her. And she said to him, "Excuse me, do you have any bubble gum?" This guy was stunned. He gave his rifle to another soldier, picked up Sarah in his arms, took her to a back room, came back holding her in one arm and a tray in his other hand with 3 glasses of lemonade, one for Sarah, one for my wife, one for myself. And then they moved us to the front of the line. He put us in his Jeep and drove us to the taxi stand. The power of a little life. The power of a little child. I remember one year listening to a man who was a big-name banker. His name was Harvey Milcon in the United States. Big bear of a man. And he said once many people had tried to reach him for Christ, and he just gave them a hard time and roughed them up. And just as he was about to take a big cruise, his little granddaughter came and said, "Grandpa, can I sit on your lap?" And he took that little girl and placed her on his lap. And she looked into his eyes and says, "You're going on a long cruise. If anything happens to you, I will not see you in heaven because you don't know Jesus." And this big burly man talking to our audience at one of our founding weekends, his lips were still quivering when he told the story to remind us how his little granddaughter caused him to think about eternity as no other sophisticated philosopher or questioner ever had. I am reminded again and again and again of our Lord Jesus, who was asked to define the kingdom, who did not take a rabbi, he did not take a philosopher, did not take a wealthy person, but he took a little child and placed the child in the midst and said, "Of such is the kingdom of heaven, and unless you become as one of these, you too will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And so I look here at a home with 2 little babies about to be delivered. Children are big anywhere in the world in the eyes of their parents. But especially in the Eastern and Middle Eastern culture, there's something extraordinary about the ceremonial side of pre-delivery and post-delivery. I remember my mother, who was born and raised in Chennai. In all of her years, when she died at the age of 57, she would still refer to a pregnancy as a confinement. She'd say, during my confinement. It had all of the cultural trappings of how a child was actually carried for the 9 months, almost in that solitary setting, as the baby was prepared to be made to enter into the world. And so here are 2 children about to be born, and they are told that they're going to represent 2 nations. And once these 2 boys were born, the mangling process began. The first was this: the parents did the worst possible thing by overtly favoring one against the other. Do you know what that does to a child? When that child recognizes that they are not a preferred one? It doesn't even have to be true, but if they think it, it reaps consequences. I'm not even sure it was true in my life, but I sure did think it. My brothers and sisters all excelled. I didn't. I actually didn't see my dad. I was born here in Puraswakam, and I didn't see my dad till I was over a year. He was in Nottingham studying. And I don't know what all went into it, but I remember the hard days and the hard knocks and the hard thrashings right into my teens. And I thought to myself, does he really not like me? I didn't ask about love. Does he really not like me? He did what he thought was best. I've never borne a grudge on that, but I do remember what I thought. I do remember feeling that my older brother was a cat's whiskers, and I was nothing. Solomon, one of my English writers, favorite English writers, F.W. Borum, says this: "Great was the wisdom of Solomon, for he demonstrated one day more vividly and dramatically than it had ever been demonstrated before the utter unreliability of mathematics on the higher planes of human experience. There is a sense, I suppose, in which twice one are two, a sense in which 2 and 2 are 4, a sense in which many other propositions of this kind are partly, if not wholly, true. It is difficult to see how merchants and accountants and other excellent and well-meaning people could go back to their desks and counting houses if their faith in these arithmetical conclusions was seriously shaken. I hasten to say, therefore, that there is a plane, the plane of ledgers and cash books, on which these propositions are approximately sound. But if you rise up from that plane to a loftier one, you will find at once that they are actually untenable. They simply will not work. Solomon proves it at the city gate. It may be true that half a sovereign and half a sovereign make one sovereign. It is obviously untrue that half a baby and half a baby make one baby. Let the sword do its deadly work. Let it cleave this baby into 2 parts. Half a baby plus half a baby will represent but the grim and gruesome mockery of a child. 2 halves of a baby do not make a baby at all. On this higher plane of human sentiment and experience, the laws of mathematics completely collapse. When, for example, a man distributes his wealth among his children, he gives to each a part. But when a woman distributes her love among her children, she gives it all to each of them. I do not believe that any man who has once fallen in love will ever be persuaded that 1 and 1 are only 2. He looks at her, and he feels that 1 plus 1 would be 1,000,000. I do not believe that any happy couple, into the sweet shelter of whose home a little child has come, will ever be convinced that 2 and 1 are only 3. Life has been enriched 1,000-fold by the addition of that one little life to theirs. And I'm certain that no pair from whose clinging and protecting arms their treasure has been snatched will find comfort in the assurance that assurance that 1 from 3 leaves 2. In the great crises of life, one's faith in figures breaks down hopelessly. In the great crises of life, one's faith in figures breaks down hopelessly. You know, there's a particular bird called the Manx shearwater. They are birds of the open ocean. Most of that breed are found in the southwest of Wales. Skockum's one of those little towns. They only go back to their hometown to lay an egg in a little burrow, and then they're back over the high seas. Many years ago, those who study these species took one of these little birds and took it 250 miles away to Cambridge. It flew back for 7 hours straight till it got right back to its hometown where it could lay its egg. They tried another time to take one to Boston's Logan Airport, thousands of miles away. 12 days non-stop, flying 250 miles a day, the bird came back to its home. That homing instinct is not just in the creaturely world. It's in the world, particularly of the human heart. We all long to be home. And when home becomes the place where you are emasculated in some way, where the sword has done its work, and you are not the fair-haired child, and you are the one who has been favored against, it makes for a very, very lonely world of rejection. I remember many years ago dealing with this when I was still a young lad. I think somewhere here I had written down one of the pieces of poem that I wanted to read for you. It came to my mind as I was working on this message this afternoon. It was the 1970s. I was living in Toronto. I had a little red Volkswagen. I was a student. And I was driving on the highway. The main highway in Toronto is the 401. It was a cold night. And I saw a guy sort of unsteady on his feet, asking for a ride. So I pulled up on the side of the road, and I saw him, and he was somewhat unsure of himself. I said, "Come on in. I'll drive you to where you're going." And he looked at me and was not sure whether he'd made the right decision or what. I was not sure whether I'd made the right decision. His name was Lorne Lusthouse. Remember that? And I talked to him and sat with him for about 1 or 2 hours till he sobered up a bit. And he said to me, "Why did you do this tonight?" I said, "I saw you unsteady on your feet. I thought you were going to get hit." And he said, "I don't know how to say thanks to you." I said, "Lorne, one thing you can do for me is give me a few minutes to talk to you. I want to talk to you about Jesus Christ who can rescue your life. You're in trouble." And he said, "Can we do that another day?" He said, "I'm really not feeling too good." I said, "That's fine." I said, "I'm heading out to Edmonton, Alberta tomorrow. I'll be back in 7 or 8 days. Give me your phone number, we'll connect." And I went back to Midwest, I went on to Midwest, Alberta, finished my meetings, came back, and one of the first things I did was try to contact his home. And I was told he had burned himself to death that week. He lit a match and burned himself. And his mother said, "He told me about you." And she said, "I want you to read a poem he left on his desk. Lost in a world of darkness, without a guiding light, seeking a friend to help, my struggling, failing plight. Now, all of you good people, just go on passing by, leaving me with nothing but this lonely will to die. Somewhere in this lonely world of sorrow and of woe, there's a place for me to hide, but where, I do not know. For no matter where I go, I never will escape the devil's reaching, clutching hands or the drink of fermented grape. So out of my grief and anguish, perhaps some wandering boy will see, long after I have left this world, and build his own life strong and good and free." He must have been a brilliant young man. I don't know what went wrong, and you never know what goes wrong. But one of the things every young person and every child needs in this world is acceptance. They need to be accepted no matter where they are, in what condition they are. You cannot celebrate everything they do, but you can accept them in the situation in which you find them. And if a parent doesn't know how to even treat that child with the love that it treats every other child with, something is going to go wrong. In my book, Walking from East to West, I tell the redeeming factor in my life. My mother was a teacher in Delhi. I used to be playing for my high school cricket team and loved just whiling away my hours in cricket. But I never went to play cricket in the afternoon after I came home until I did one thing. I lived there in that community called Kakanagar in Delhi, and I would stand outside in our driveway. As long as I remember I did this. I would wait till that 3:30 bus came, about 100 yards away, and I'd see my mother get off that bus and start walking towards the house. As soon as I would see her walking towards the home, I felt it was okay now, I could go and play. Try to ask me to explain that. Somewhere in this lonely world of sorrow and of woe, there's a place for me to hide, but where I do not know. And all of us will hide in the shelter of the love of somebody who is accepting you. And you have these 2 young men born, and they are mangled. But the second thing that happens in this home is there's a breakdown of communication. Twice in the book of Genesis, once in 26 and once in 28, we are told that Esau had no idea what his parents were thinking about him in certain ways, especially with the person that he'd chosen to marry multiple times. He said he was shocked to find out how deeply he'd grieved his parents. You see, talking and communication are a vital part of life. We need to find the right moment and the right words in the right mood and the right frame of reference. If you don't talk, someone else will fill that life with their ideas. But with children, you have to be very, very shrewd in knowing when to capture the right moment, because good advice is only good if it's effective, and effective advice times itself at the right moment. And you may have your plans for your kids, but they have their plans for you. And so you have to pause and wait for that right thing. So number 2 was communication, a breakdown. Number 3 was deception. They learned by observing a father and mother who were schemers and deceivers.